They had lived next door to each other for almost 30 years, separated by nothing more than a white wooden fence. Yet they had never truly met, not because they hated each other, but because life kept them walking in different directions. Then one rainy September morning, a broken fence, and one simple sentence changed everything. "Hand me the hammer." Neither Ethan nor Grace knew that the conversation, lasting only a few seconds, would become the beginning of the greatest love story their quiet Oregon town had ever witnessed. A cool September breeze drifted across the quiet hills of western Oregon, carrying the scent of wet cedar and fresh earth as pale morning light settled over two weathered wooden houses divided by nothing more than a white fence. For nearly 30 years, those two houses had stood side by side, without changing very much. Seasons painted them with rain, snow, and sunshine. Families came and went, flowers bloomed and faded, storms bent the old trees. Yet the narrow white fence remained where it had always been, quietly separating two lives that had never truly crossed. On the left lived Ethan Walker. At 30 years old, Ethan had the kind of face that looked older than his age, not because of wrinkles, but because silence had carved itself into his expression. He stood a little over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, shaped by years of lifting lumber and building furniture by hand. His dark brown hair was usually cut short without much attention, and a neatly trimmed beard outlined a strong jaw that rarely smiled in public. His gray-blue eyes carried the calm steadiness of someone who had learned long ago that life rarely offered second chances. Around town, people respected him because he always finished what he started. He repaired barns without overcharging, helped elderly neighbors fix broken porches when they asked, and never spoke badly about anyone. Yet few people could say they actually knew him. 8 years earlier, Ethan had buried both of his parents after a terrible highway accident during a winter storm. Losing them within the same week had quietly changed something inside him. Since then, he had buried himself in work instead of conversation. Every morning before sunrise, he unlocked his woodworking shop on the edge of town, and every evening he returned home after dark, too tired, or perhaps too unwilling, to let anyone get close enough to ask how he was really doing. Across the white fence stood the other house. Grace Collins had returned there only 6 months earlier. She was 30 years old, with chestnut brown hair that naturally curled at the ends whenever the Oregon air became damp. Her clear green eyes held a quiet intelligence, though sadness sometimes lingered behind them when she believed nobody was watching. She was neither particularly tall nor short, with a graceful build strengthened more by determination than physical strength. Her skin carried the soft warmth of someone who spent more time outdoors than indoors since coming back home. Unlike Ethan, Grace smiled easily, but it was often a smile offered to reassure other people rather than herself. Her childhood had never stayed in one place for very long. Her parents had spent years traveling across several states restoring historic buildings, forcing Grace to attend a different school almost every other year. While other children built lifelong friendships, she learned how to pack boxes quickly and say goodbye without crying. The old Collins house in Oregon had always remained untouched, waiting patiently for the day the family might finally settle down. That day never came. Within 2 years, illness claimed both of Grace's parents. Instead of selling the old family house, Grace resigned from her office job in Portland and returned to the only place that still felt connected to them. The house had been empty for years. The roof leaked in several places. The porch leaned slightly to one side. Sections of the fence had begun collapsing long before she arrived. She spent every dollar she had saved simply making the place livable again. The strange part was this. Although Ethan and Grace had technically been neighbors for most of their lives, they had never truly met. As children, Ethan left for school before sunrise to help his father at the workshop afterward, while Grace was usually living somewhere hundreds of miles away with her parents. During the rare summers she returned, Ethan often worked construction jobs outside town. They had likely seen each other from a distance dozens of times without realizing it. Each knew only that someone lived in the neighboring house. Neither knew the other's name. Neither had ever shared a conversation. Neither had ever walked through the other's front door. Life had simply continued, quietly placing them only a few yards apart, while leading them in completely different directions. Then September arrived with one of the strongest storms the valley had seen all year. Wind tore branches from towering fir trees, and scattered broken fence boards across both properties. Rain continued through most of the night before finally giving way to a cool, silent morning. Grace carried a hammer, several nails, and a rough pine board toward the damaged fence. She had never rebuilt a fence before, but hiring someone was simply beyond her budget. She balanced the loose board against a leaning post and struck the nail once. Twice. The board shifted unexpectedly. A sharp splintered edge snapped backward across her hand. She pulled away immediately, wincing as a thin line of blood appeared across her palm. For a brief moment, frustration overwhelmed her. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and whispered to herself that she could handle one more problem. She had handled every other one alone. From the opposite yard, Ethan looked up from stacking freshly cut cedar planks beside his workshop. He noticed the broken fence. He noticed the blood on her hand. Then, for reasons he could not immediately explain, he set the lumber aside. He walked toward the white fence. For the first time in nearly 30 years, he stepped through the opening between their properties and stopped only a few feet away from the woman who had lived beside him almost his entire life. He looked at the crooked board, then at the hammer still clutched in her uninjured hand. Finally, he spoke the first words either of them had ever heard from the other. "Hand me the hammer." The following Tuesday, just after sunrise, Ethan Walker appeared at the broken fence carrying a toolbox that looked older than both of them. He did not knock on Grace Collins' front door or call her name. He simply set the heavy wooden box on the ground beside the fence and examined the boards as if he had already decided what needed to be done before leaving his own yard. Grace stepped onto her porch holding a steaming enamel coffee pot. For a brief second, she wondered whether he had come because he felt responsible for helping her the week before or because he genuinely wanted to. She still knew almost nothing about the quiet carpenter who had lived next door nearly all her life. Yet something about the way he measured each damaged board without rushing made the silence feel comfortable rather than awkward. "I can make the coffee stronger if you don't like it," she said. Without looking away from the fence, Ethan answered, "This is probably better than what I make." It was the closest thing to a joke she had heard from him. Grace smiled before she realized she was smiling. Ethan spent the next 3 hours replacing warped fence rails one careful board at a time. He never wasted a nail, never struck the hammer twice when once would do, and paused occasionally to study the wood as though it deserved respect before becoming part of someone's home. Watching him work reminded Grace of something her father used to say: "Good craftsmen repaired more than buildings." When the fence stood straight again, Ethan gathered his tools. "You'll need to reinforce the porch before winter," he said. Grace looked toward the aging front steps. "I know. I'll come back next Tuesday." She blinked. "You don't have to." "I know." Then he walked home. The following Tuesday, he returned exactly as promised. He repaired loose porch boards that had begun pulling away from the foundation after years of Oregon rain. The Tuesday after that, he replaced broken hinges on the weathered barn doors where Grace stored old gardening tools. A week later, he dug a shallow drainage channel behind the house after noticing water collecting too close to the foundation. Grace never asked him to come. Ethan never asked for payment. Without discussing it, they developed their own quiet routine. Every Tuesday morning, a fresh pot of coffee waited on the porch before Ethan arrived. Sometimes homemade biscuits appeared beside it. Sometimes cinnamon bread. Neither of them mentioned that the arrangement had become a habit. Instead, they talked. At first, the conversation stayed safely on practical things: weather forecasts, lumber prices, vegetable gardens, and the coming winter. Gradually, those subjects disappeared. Grace spoke about growing up in different towns across Oregon and neighboring states, while following her parents from one restoration project to another. She described learning not to unpack all her belongings because another move always came sooner than expected. She admitted she had spent most of her childhood introducing herself to strangers and saying goodbye before friendships had time to grow. "I stopped expecting people to stay," she confessed quietly. Ethan stirred his coffee. "I stopped expecting people to arrive." The words lingered between them. One Tuesday afternoon, they began comparing childhood memories of Millfield. To both their surprise, those memories overlapped. Grace remembered walking to the old elementary school every morning with her mother during the years they briefly lived in town. "I always left around 8, she said. Ethan laughed softly. "I left before 7. Dad opened the workshop early." Grace looked at him. "So we walked the same road. Different hours." A week later, she discovered an old photograph while unpacking dusty boxes in the attic. The picture showed the annual Autumn Harvest Festival held 22 years earlier. Children filled the town square, carrying paper lanterns. Near the left edge stood a small girl with curly brown hair, wearing a yellow sweater. Grace. Near the opposite side stood a thin, dark-haired boy helping his father stack wooden benches. Ethan. Separated by less than 30 feet, neither looking toward the other. She carried the photograph next door the following Tuesday. Ethan stared at it for nearly a minute. I don't remember this. Neither do I. He shook his head slowly. We were right there. So close. And still strangers. That discovery somehow felt stranger than meeting each other for the first time. As autumn settled deeper across Millfield, people began noticing Ethan's Tuesday routine. The first comments came harmlessly. Then they became jokes. At Harper's General Store, old customers exchanged knowing smiles whenever Ethan bought extra nails or lumber. One afternoon, a cheerful retired farmer named Walter Briggs, whose broad frame, silver mustache, and booming laugh had made him one of the town's friendliest faces for decades, grinned as Ethan carried cedar boards toward the register. Took you 30 years to say hello to your neighbors, son? Several people chuckled. Ethan answered without embarrassment. I suppose it did. Walter laughed even harder. Well, don't wait another 30 before asking her to dinner. The entire store erupted in laughter. That evening, Grace heard almost the same joke from another customer at the bakery. Apparently, the whole town had decided that two lifelong neighbors finally becoming friends was the most interesting story Millfield had seen in years. As she stood on her porch the following Tuesday with 2 steaming mugs waiting before Ethan arrived, she caught herself smiling. 30 years had passed before either of them spoke a single sentence. Perhaps, she thought, some conversations simply took longer to begin. By the middle of October, Tuesday mornings had quietly become part of life on both sides of the white fence. Ethan Walker no longer checked whether anything needed repairing before crossing the yard. Somehow there was always another loose board, another stubborn hinge, another patch of earth where rainwater refused to drain properly. Grace Collins stopped pretending to be surprised when she heard the familiar sound of his boots on the gravel. She simply placed 2 mugs of hot coffee on the porch railing before he arrived. What neither of them expected was how closely a small town could observe something so ordinary. Millfield had fewer than 1,000 residents, and stories traveled faster than autumn wind. By the end of the month, nearly everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some believed Ethan was helping Grace because he pitied the lonely woman who had returned home after losing her parents. Others insisted Grace had cleverly found herself a hard-working neighbor willing to repair an old house without charging a single dollar. Neither version resembled the truth. Grace first heard the rumors while buying flour at Harper's General Store. Behind her stood Linda Foster, a woman in her early 50s with neatly pinned blonde hair, sharp brown eyes, and the polished appearance of someone who valued appearances almost as much as she valued conversation. Linda rarely intended to be cruel, but years of organizing every community event had left her believing she understood everyone's life better than they did themselves. It's wonderful Ethan has such a generous heart, Linda said pleasantly enough. Some people would never take on another person's responsibilities. Grace turned. What responsibilities? Oh, your house, dear. Linda smiled. A woman alone needs help. It's only natural. The words stayed with Grace long after she returned home. The next afternoon, she overheard 2 men outside the feed store laughing that Ethan had become the free carpenter next door. For the first time since returning to Oregon, embarrassment settled where hope had begun to grow. She had spent months trying to rebuild her life without depending on anyone. Now the town believed she could not even repair her own home. The following Tuesday, Ethan arrived carrying cedar boards to replace part of the old porch railing. Grace met him before he reached the steps. You don't have to keep coming, she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised. I know. I mean it. His expression remained calm. Did something happen? She hesitated. They're talking. They always talk. This is different. They'll stop. They won't. She lowered her eyes. They're saying you feel sorry for me. They're saying I'm using you. For several seconds, only the wind moved between them. Then Ethan rested the boards against the fence. Do you believe that? Grace answered honestly. No, neither do I. She forced a small smile that disappeared almost immediately. I still think you should stop coming. He studied her face. recognizing something deeper than frustration. It was pride. The same pride that had brought her back to an aging house instead of selling it. The same pride that made her repair broken fences with bleeding hands. "If that's what you want," he said gently, "I'll respect it." She nodded. "I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize." Without another word, Ethan picked up the cedar boards and walked back across the yard. It was the first Tuesday in weeks that ended with only one untouched coffee mug cooling on Grace's porch. That evening, an uneasy silence settled over the valley. Dark clouds rolled across the mountains far earlier than weather forecasts had predicted. By sunset, the wind began pushing through the tall fir trees with a deep, restless sound. Around midnight, the storm arrived. Rain struck the rooftops in heavy sheets while thunder echoed through the hills. Branches snapped somewhere beyond the fields. The electricity failed across half the valley, leaving only flashes of lightning to reveal the outlines of the neighboring houses. Grace had barely reached her front window when an explosive crack shattered the darkness. An enormous old Douglas fir that had stood beside the property for decades finally surrendered to the wind. The massive trunk crashed directly onto the roof of her weathered barn. Wood splintered. Roof beams collapsed. From inside came the frightened cries of Daisy, Grace's 11-year-old bay mare. The gentle horse had white markings across her forehead and calm dark eyes that trusted people completely. Grace had rescued Daisy from a neglected farm the previous spring, and since then the aging mare had become her closest companion. Without thinking, Grace grabbed a lantern and ran into the rain. She reached the damaged barn just as another section of the roof groaned overhead. Daisy, the frightened horse, pulled desperately against her halter, trapped beneath fallen beams. Grace pushed at the heavy timber with both hands. It barely moved. Across the fence, another door slammed open. Ethan had heard the crash before he fully woke. By the time he saw the broken roof through the rain, he was already pulling on his work boots. He never stopped to consider the conversation from that afternoon. He never wondered whether Grace wanted his help. Instinct carried him across the yard long before thought could argue otherwise. He reached the barn soaked by rain and immediately threw his shoulder beneath the fallen beam. "On three," he shouted. Together they lifted just enough for Daisy to stumble free into the storm. The mare bolted toward the pasture while the weakened roof collapsed completely behind them. Breathing hard beneath the pouring rain, Grace stared at Ethan. Only hours earlier she had asked him to stay away. Yet when everything fell apart, he came anyway. Not because he felt obligated, not because the town expected him to, but because the thought of her facing that night alone had never truly been an option. Morning arrived beneath a pale Oregon sky washed clean by the storm. The air smelled of soaked cedar, damp earth, and freshly broken pine. Sunlight filtered through drifting clouds, revealing the damage the night had left behind. Grace Collins stood quietly in front of the collapsed barn, her boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. Beside her, Ethan Walker studied the broken beams with the same calm focus he brought to every difficult task. Neither of them mentioned what had happened in the rain. Some moments were too important to be explained immediately. "The loft is probably unstable," Ethan said after a long silence. Grace nodded. "There are still boxes up there. They belong to my parents. We should get them out before we rebuild." Together, they spent the morning clearing fallen timber. The work was slow but steady. Ethan carefully cut away damaged beams while Grace gathered tools and carried smaller pieces outside. They worked almost without speaking, yet their silence no longer felt uncertain. It had become the comfortable silence of two people who trusted each other's rhythm. By early afternoon, they climbed into what remained of the hay loft. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight where the roof had split open. Most of the old trunks were soaked but intact. As Ethan lifted a loose floorboard that had shifted during the collapse, his hammer struck something solid beneath it. "There's a compartment here." Grace knelt beside him. Hidden below the weathered planks rested a small cedar box wrapped in faded canvas. Time had darkened the wood until it was almost black, but the brass hinges still held firm. Grace carefully brushed away decades of dust. "My mother never mentioned this." Ethan turned the box over. "Neither did my father." Inside lay several leather-bound journals, bundles of carefully folded letters tied with blue ribbon, and a rolled map of the neighboring properties. The first journal carried a familiar name written in careful ink. Samuel Collins, Grace's father. The second journal bore another, Daniel Walker, Ethan's father. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Grace slowly opened her father's journal, while Ethan unfolded his own father's notebook. The handwriting was different, yet the dates matched almost perfectly. The earliest entries described two young men determined to build homes beside one another instead of buying cheaper land elsewhere. Daniel Walker had written, asterisk, "A good neighbor is worth more than another 100 acres. Samuel says our children should grow up as family, even if they are not born into the same name." Asterisk. Grace's eyes widened. They planned this. Ethan nodded silently. Page after page revealed stories neither of them had ever heard. Their fathers had spent 3 summers cutting timber together from the same hillside. They raised both houses side by side with their own hands, sharing tools, meals, and impossible dreams. Every fence post had been measured together. Every fruit tree had been planted on the understanding that future generations would always have someone trustworthy living only a few steps away. Grace smiled through gathering tears. "My father used to say houses remember the people who built them. So did mine." They exchanged a quiet glance before returning to the journals. The entries changed several years later. The cheerful stories became shorter, then almost disappeared. Eventually, Grace found the explanation tucked inside an old envelope. It was not betrayal. It was not money. It was not land. It was a misunderstanding. During one difficult winter, a cattle buyer falsely claimed that Daniel had agreed to sell lumber promised to Samuel. Hurt pride prevented either man from asking the other what had truly happened. Weeks became months. Months became years. Neither friendship survived long enough for the truth to be spoken aloud. Grace exhaled slowly. All those years. For something that could probably have been solved in 5 minutes. Yet the journals told another story hidden beneath the silence. Although they no longer visited each other's homes, the two men never completely stopped caring. One winter entry recorded anonymous firewood mysteriously appearing behind the Collins house after Samuel injured his shoulder. Another described someone quietly repairing part of the Walker roof, while Daniel was away transporting lumber. Neither journal ever named the helper. Neither needed to. Grace laughed softly through tears. They knew. They always knew. Ethan carefully unfolded the final document. It was a simple hand-drawn map showing both properties connected by a narrow gate sketched directly through the fence line. Below it, Daniel had written, asterisk, "Maybe one day our children will build the gate we were too stubborn to make." Asterisk. Grace sat back against an old beam, unable to look away from the faded drawing. For 30 years, she had believed the white fence represented distance. Now she realized it had originally been built to keep two families close. She looked toward Ethan, whose expression carried the same mixture of sadness and quiet wonder. "It's strange," she whispered. "What is?" "We spent our whole lives thinking we were strangers." He looked down at the journals resting between them. "Maybe we never were." Grace closed her father's notebook gently, her fingers resting on the worn leather cover. For the first time since returning home, she felt as though the old house had finally answered the question she had been asking since her parents were gone. Perhaps destiny had simply taken 30 years to finish the story their fathers had never been given the chance to complete. A full year passed with the quiet certainty only small towns seemed to understand. Oregon's seasons circled through another autumn, a snowy winter, a gentle spring, and finally returned to warm September mornings scented with pine and wild grass. Time had changed many things, yet the greatest change could be seen between the two neighboring houses. The old white fence was gone. In its place stood a new cedar fence that Ethan Walker had built by hand, using timber harvested from trees brought down during the previous winter's storm. The fence was sturdy, beautifully crafted, and designed to last for generations. At its center stood a simple wooden gate, wide enough for two people to walk through side by side. It was not locked. It had never been locked. Grace Collins often smiled whenever she noticed it standing open in the morning sunlight. During the first weeks, she had almost closed it out of habit. Then she remembered the sketch they had discovered inside their father's journals, a gate two stubborn friends had imagined but never built. Every day the open gate reminded her that unfinished dreams sometimes belonged to the next generation. The neighbors noticed it too. At first they joked that Ethan had shortened his walk by 20 steps. Months later nobody joked anymore. They simply accepted that two neighboring homes had quietly become one extended family. On the first Tuesday morning of September, Exactly 1 year after Ethan had crossed the broken fence carrying nothing but quiet determination, he stood outside his own front door, holding something entirely unfamiliar. There was no toolbox, no hammer, no measuring tape. Instead, he carried a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered before sunrise from the hillside overlooking Millfield. Purple lupins, white daisies, yellow balsam root, and blue flax rested awkwardly in his large, calloused hands. He had spent his life building tables, porches, and barns. Arranging flowers proved unexpectedly more difficult. He looked down at them and smiled to himself. They'll have to do. For perhaps the first time in many years, Ethan felt nervous. Not because he doubted what he wanted, because he understood exactly how much it mattered. He walked through the little gate connecting the 2 yards instead of using the road. Halfway across he stopped. Then he quietly turned around. He walked back to the front path, crossed to Grace's front porch, and stood before her front door. It seemed important somehow. For 30 years they had entered each other's lives by accident, through fences, storms, repairs, and shared coffee. Today deserved a beginning chosen on purpose. He raised his hand. Knock, knock, knock. Inside the house, footsteps approached. The door opened. Grace stood there wearing a light blue sweater, her chestnut hair loosely gathered behind her shoulders, sunlight catching the green in her eyes. Over the past year, grief had gradually released its hold on her face. She still carried memories of loss, but they no longer defined her expression. Hope had quietly taken their place. She looked first at the flowers, then at Ethan, then at the fact that he was standing on her front porch instead of already working somewhere around the property. A smile slowly appeared. You forgot your toolbox. I left it at home. I noticed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them no longer needed explaining. It had become one of the languages they shared. Finally, Ethan held out the flowers. For the first time in 30 years, he said softly, I'd like to knock on my neighbor's door. Grace stared at him. Tears gathered before she even realized they were there. She laughed through them, wiping one away with the back of her hand. Good, she whispered. I've been waiting to hear that knock. She paused, smiling with the honesty he loved most about her. Almost my entire life. She accepted the flowers. Instead of stepping back into the house, she stepped forward onto the porch beside him. Their hands found each other naturally, as though they had already practiced the movement 100 times without noticing. No dramatic speeches followed. Neither believed love needed many words after a year of proving itself through ordinary Tuesdays. Several months later, beneath a clear autumn sky, the people of Millfield gathered between the 2 neighboring houses. Folding chairs filled the grass where children had once played decades earlier. Daisy wandered peacefully beyond the pasture fence, lazily chewing hay as if supervising the ceremony. Walter Briggs stood near the front row wearing his best suit and smiling broadly before the service had even begun. Linda Foster, whose rumors had once spread through town faster than the wind, quietly arranged flowers along the aisle and later admitted to Grace that she had never been happier to discover she had been wrong about 2 people. The ceremony itself was simple. No grand decorations, no orchestra, only family, neighbors, old memories, and promises spoken honestly beneath the Oregon sky. When Ethan and Grace exchanged vows, neither promised perfection. They promised presence. To keep showing up. To keep listening. To keep choosing each other, especially on ordinary Tuesdays. Afterward, everyone gathered outside between the 2 houses, where laughter drifted across the hills until sunset. As evening settled over the valley, the little wooden gate remained open, just as it always had since Ethan built it. It no longer connected only 2 backyards. It connected 2 families, 2 unfinished stories, and 2 hearts that had lived side by side since childhood. They had simply needed 30 years to finally find their way home. Sometimes God's greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder, riches, or extraordinary signs. Sometimes they begin with a simple knock on a neighbor's door. Ethan and Grace spent 30 years living only a few steps apart, yet God's timing was different from their own. While they thought they were waiting for love, perhaps God was quietly shaping their hearts, teaching them patience, healing old wounds, and preparing them for the moment they were finally ready to meet. Maybe someone watching today feels like life has passed them by. Maybe you've been praying for an answer that hasn't come, or wondering why certain doors have remained closed. Don't lose hope. God often works in silence long before we can see his purpose. What feels like a delay may actually be his perfect preparation. The blessing meant for you may already be closer than you realize. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, or share a moment when God surprised you with a blessing you never expected. Your story may become the encouragement someone else needs today. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who could use a little hope. May God bless you and your family with peace, strength, good health, and faithful hearts. May he guide your steps, open the right doors at the right time, and remind you every day that his plans are always greater than our own. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until we meet again, may God's grace go with you wherever life leads.